just discuss the world, and my grandfather most of the time would smoke his pipe. It was just a very different form or time where people did not run around all the time. They actually enjoyed, you know. And nowadays, people, even if they're off on Sundays or whatever, they're either constantly doing something or watching something on TV, but there's very little communication considering the time that I lived in. So through that communication, whittling became a very well-known pastime that people did. And so they enjoyed it. They enjoyed something to do. And like I said, people didn't have any money, so they didn't have money for, you know, even if they'd have had video games and all that stuff, people didn't have the money for it anyway. So they found their cheapest hobby, and anyone could take a piece of wood off of or a branch off of a tree and have a knife and sit there and whittle a figure out of it or whittle something out of it. So it goes way back a long time, even in times when they, you know, you had wood carvers and those things of there. But I'm talking more about the hobby side of it, and that's what I'm trying to discuss now. You know, Europe had more carvers, Germany, Switzerland, those places like that. They were much more well known for carving than we were, because a lot of that is where your masters of carvers came from, is those schools of carving that they had back then. And they did a lot of architectural carving, like the leaves and this stuff on buildings and such as that they would do. So, but actually whittling was anything just like today. Now, back then they didn't have the fancy knives that we have, which I love, you know, because a lot of you still carve with pocket knives, so the old way, but now you don't. You know, you have these carving knives that you can use, and to me are much better in such a way. So whittling became a pastime, and it was a very common pastime. Now, as technology began to come in, of course, then as everybody knows, handmade things and whittling and stuff like that began to not be taken up by, you know, every art has to be taken up by a generation. A generation has to decide in their mind that they also want to do that, or what happens is the art dies. And that's really what is happening with a lot of carving and whittling and stuff like that, that the art is not as popular as it used to be. And of course in today it's a very slow process of that. So as you can see, the little figure that I'm sitting here just talking to you doing, to concentrate on as we do our little discussion as we go through there. So when we step back, we realize that the spare time, or the what we would call boredom time today, I mean, kids now, I mean, you know, they can't be bored for 5 seconds. They just don't understand that. But we learned as kids and stuff that, you know, if you wanted to not be bored, then you had to go find something to not be bored about. So whittling was one of them. We used to play baseball, and just those type of things kept us from becoming bored. So whittling, carving, those things kept a lot of adults to have a good time enjoying what they did. So it became a popular aspect back there, and people enjoyed it. Now carving or whittling was mostly a man's. It was mostly a man's art back then. It was not considered really, an elegant type art, but it was mostly men did it, because men carried pocket knives. There were some women that carried knives, but very few. Most of them, there were some women that we used to call tomboys, that had like the old Tom Sawyer type people. But in most cases, it was a man's thing. That men, did those things and all that other stuff. It was later that women began to also carve and do with. So it's an interesting concept of how we look at whittling and carving today, as we don't. Now I think people still love it. They just don't see it as what they used to see it at one time as we go. And the art of sitting down and just doing something like this becomes the issue that you are doing. Okay, now since a lot of these people sold their pieces to rich people, as I've told you, when they would often have estate sales, people in museums would scoop up these very, very famous carvings and whittlings for practically nothing. And a lot of people didn't know what they had. They had them in their homes. They had bought them at a relatively cheap price, just like the rich people. A lot of these guys that carved, they didn't know what their pieces were worth, and their pieces were not worth all that much anyway at that time, because they were not yet famous, as we might say. When it comes, people didn't have art shows, and well, they had art shows, but most people didn't make it. Didn't get mocked. Wait, we're going to do the face now as we work. But so as we look at what carving and whittling was today, we look and understand that it was a whole different era of how it got started. And a whole different era now forms in how that it is slowly, as we might say, perhaps dying. Because different things, like I said, become that way. I don't think that wood carving will die altogether. I really and honestly don't. I don't believe that wood carving will completely die and no one will take an interest in it, or whittling or whatever. I don't think that's going to happen. Now, will it diminish? Yes, I believe it will. I believe that the hobby will diminish somewhat, because it's just not, there's too much entertainment to come against it today, to fight with it. There's too much, well, I mean, they have everything that is available to young people. And just like anything else, if young people don't take up the art, then it begins to die and it begins to fall. And do we have enough young people take it? I think we do, to keep it going. I don't think we do to it becoming famous or anything like that. But I think we have enough to keep it going when the older carvers do die off, like myself one day and all that other stuff. Then things will be different. There's a lot of things that's going to be different. So, anyway, that is kind of a quick what I know of history about, whittling and wood carving. It's remember, there are different types of carvings, so each one of them has its own history. I'm mostly talking about whittling at the time, and what went on during that period and what went on in that time. But I have actually seen some carvings from the Civil War that were made by hand, and they were very crude. They were. America had not entered a time of, the Europeans for years had already been producing some pretty amazing wood carvings, and but America was not doing that as much as the American people were. The industrial age that we went through and all kinds of things like that. We went through an industrial age at one time, and so things really began to change, where your European countries stayed more primitive, and as they stayed more primitive, then they would do these things. I don't know if many of you saw a movie called, if you did not see it, I'm not a big fan of Jane Fonda, okay? I'm just not. But she did a movie years and years ago called The Doll Maker, where she was a wood carver, a woman wood carver in the rural areas, and it was a very sad story about people in poverty and how she sold one of her carvings, or actually broke the carving up and made smaller pieces and stuff like that, so that she could leave with her family and stuff. So it's a very good show. A very good show. It talks a lot about how people lived in rural areas and how they had to, just get by. And she used wood carving as a form to help supplement her income to feed her family and to give them what they needed. Very, very good show. Like I said, I am not a big Jane Fonda fan, but she did play a good part, and it was a good story about a woman who was a carver, and in the end she whittled some animals to sell to a store to get enough money to go back to the farm and stuff like that. So good show, very good show, called The Doll Maker. And when she, and in this movie, you'll see that a lot of the carvings that she sold were sold. She'd make what was called jumping jacks. She would whittle these jumping jacks, and what it was like she would whittle the arms and the head and all this stuff separate, and then she'd run string through them, and as you pull the string up and down, it would look like the figure was jumping up and down. And they were called jumping jacks back then. And she whittled these figures. If you get a chance, see the show. Every wood carver needs to see it. There was one with Tom Berenger also about carving. I can't remember, and he was going to carve a nativity for a child for Christmas, and he was carving each one at a time. And then I won't get into the story. I can't remember it all. It's been a long time since I've watched it. Very good also show. One of the most famous carving westerns ever. Oh gosh, A Lonesome Dove. Lonesome Dove. Robert Duvall played Gus, a character in there, and I don't know if a lot of you remember it, but Gus would whittle out little horses and things like that. Robert Duvall played the part, and you'd see him at the camp. And that's another thing too. During the Western days, a lot of the guys, like I said, that were on trail drives and stuff, at night they would sit around and people would play. See, people would play instruments, and the guys would sit there and they'd have knives and they'd whittle. They'd whittle on little figures and little things, and the cowboys would make little horses and stuff like that. It was a time of that people just they had free time, but it was free time only at a certain time, like at night or whatever it is, and to kill the boredom, other than drinking, they would do that. They would whittle and do those type of things. So that all goes. You say, well, what difference does that make? It makes a lot of difference, because it had a history in whittling and carving. Because a lot of pieces came from that. Now the tramp art that you find today is not wood. Most of it is not wood. Most of it is cardboard. It's that they took, but it's still a form of whittling that they did. It's only cardboard because they didn't have enough money to have wood most of the time. But it's all a pattern of leisure time, of boredom that these men had. And like the tramps, when they were looking for jobs or looking for whatever, they would sit around at night. And just like the men at the campfires who worked trail drives and were out in the West, they would do that at night around the fires and around the things. So there was a factor in all of this that now, as we do today, we still want to sit around the campfire at night and do these things. Now, I can't hardly sit around a campfire at night and whittle because I have to have light. I'm getting so old, but I have to have a place to where I can see, and because my eyes are not like what they used to be. But that is why that people had a lot of free time, as we commonly say, especially at nighttime. They didn't have TV, they didn't have those things to entertain them at night, so they had to produce their own entertainment. You had to make your own entertainment, and whittling was a part of that. That's what they were. Whittling was a part of that entertainment. So today, the whittling that we talk about usually is a whole different form of whittling than they did back then. They did that as a necessity back then for boredom. We do it today as just a, having a good time, enjoying ourselves. We have that, we can fill that free time with TV and with all these other things, but they couldn't. So oftentimes it would take them a lot longer to whittle pieces out and all that other stuff. Yeah, I remember, Gus whittling some horses that he had during that time. And all that. So but as you go back and you look at history and you see, and there's so much more that involves this type of hobby that can be said about it. I mean, but I think more than anything is that a lot of this was created because people had free time, but they didn't have the entertainment and technology available to them at that time to make up that free time. So they had to choose and make whatever they could to work it out the way that they had to. And that's how whittling and carving, and of course carving also, architectural carving and stuff, came into existence because people wanted finer things. People wanted good, fine work. And, people carved and made things so that people could have them. People made their own furniture. You look at the Amish people, all you have to do is look at the Amish people today and see the way that people, the Amish still make furniture, they still make this stuff, they still go back to that period of time, which we don't have to, but they do. They choose to live that type of lifestyle. So you see that form of lifestyle take precedence